Order regarding a text amendment for the Boston Zoning Code relative to fair housing and integrated communities. My name is Michelle Wu, and I'm chair of this committee. I'm joined by my colleague and the sponsor of this text amendment, Councillor Lydia Edwards. We want to remind you that this public hearing is being recorded and broadcast live on channels Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and streaming on the City of Boston website. So please silence your cell phones and other devices. The way that we will conduct this hearing is that we'll start with the first 4 people who had already signed up to testify, just to frame the issue, and then we will actually, first we'll have opening statements from councilors, then we'll go to public testimony from the first people who signed up to testify, then we will have a brief panel discussion and any question and answer with advocates from the Greater Boston Legal Services, then we will welcome our esteemed colleagues from the administration for a similar panel. In between, we may take public testimony throughout. So if you feel moved to share your thoughts at any moment, please sign in on the sign-in sheet by the door that says testify. And again, we'll take those as there are breaks in the panel discussion. Okay, so I think we've read through all of our formalities, read the docket number into the record, and I will hand it over to Councillor Lydia Edwards for an opening statement.
I just wanted to quickly set the context and give a little bit of history as to why we're having this very important conversation today and why I proposed the zoning amendment. Fair housing is the law of the land and has been since 1968. The Fair Housing Act was a landmark piece of legislation that prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. And from its inception, fair housing has been about more than just preventing instances of discrimination. For that reason, and for many years of advocacy under the Obama administration, the federal government moved to issue regulations for affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH is what I'm going to refer to it going forward. AFFH is defined as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity. In other words, cities like Boston must proactively address systems, plans, and policies that have contributed to inequality. That is our legal obligation under the Fair Housing Act. Boston is commendably pursuing its AFF planning in spite of the current administration in DC. We have a history of addressing serious fair housing issues in public housing, and under the late Bill McGonigle's leadership, we worked diligently to integrate Boston Housing Authority properties. Boston has also a painful history of planning, development, and zoning that we are trying to move away from. For this reason, it is critical we have tools in planning and zoning to address systemic fair housing issues. Planning and zoning can be tools of exclusion or inclusion. This is a debate, and the entire state is currently engaged in it. It is a complex conversation, but I'm proud that as some members of the Boston delegation are working to expand transit-oriented multifamily housing, others are working to prohibit exclusionary zoning policies. In Boston, we have an immense opportunity to shape the terms of private development and choose how to expand mitigation from it. We review and regulate the shape, size, unit, count, and type of income restrictions in proposed developments. We make discretionary financial choices, asking developers to fund things like roads, water and sewer infrastructure, parks, and of course, housing. What this amendment does is align our fair housing obligations with the choices we regularly make. It adds fair housing language into the zoning code and creates a new standard of review for very large developments, particularly multi-acre planning development areas such as Suffolk Downs. Because development and mitigation decisions are choices we can and do make, it is critical that we use them to further fair housing. It's the right thing to do, it's the law, and it's our legal obligation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. So the first 3 folks to testify will be John Walkie from Green Roots, Baolian Kwong from CPA, Chinese Progressive Association, and Louise Baxter. And if we have time, then we'll also go to Serena Ramakrishna from Conservation Law Foundation.
Hello, thank you. My name is John Walkie. I live at 63 Putnam Street in East Boston, and I work at Green Roots, an environmental justice organization that works in the neighborhood of East Boston and Chelsea. And we are an environmental justice organization, not a housing organization, so I'm not exactly sure why I'm the first person to be testifying. But there's a phrase within environmental justice that you want to improve your neighborhood to make it just green enough. Because if you make it too green, you then get displaced. If you make it too attractive and too desirable, we shouldn't be putting ourselves into that situation. As we make investments in our community, whether they are bike paths and parks and things that an environmental group would be talking about more often than not, or whether we're talking about housing developments like Suffolk Downs with 10,000 units of housing, these things should be considering what their impacts are fully. And in particular, for this fair housing proposal is critical. I think it's really needed. I just got off a long flight and read Russ Lopez's little history book, History of Boston from 1945 to 2015. And from the more well-known West End to the New York Streets neighborhood, all the way up to what's happening today through South Boston and every place else. It's a continual story of just displacement, displacement, displacement. And yet something like Suffolk Downs comes in and we look at the impact, what is it going to do to traffic, what's it going to do to the environment, and we're not looking at what is it going to do to the housing market. That many units coming in. It's like 10,000 units is, for the amount of people that are going in there, it's about a third of the population of East Boston being put in there. So this proposal is pretty critical for us to be able to start making sure that the city is doing its due diligence and looking at these projects and ensuring that we're not continuing this long history of just completely wringing out low-income people and people of color from this city, totally changing its face, its character, and really making it more inequitable. So Green Roots and myself as an East Boston resident fully support this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
It will turn on. Don't worry. No, you can stay. Feel free. It'll turn on in a second.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Bao Lianquan. I am the staff in Chinese Progress Association. I think CPA will send you the comment letter later, but today I just testify as the community organizer. I am the community organizer over 10 years, and we held less than 5 for the displacement in Chinatown. I think it's really hard because Chinatown is the only one residential district in Boston do not have the additional union protect. As like the other neighborhood, they have the union protect like low house that limit the floor air and to again the big developer. There is, the Back Bay and the South End, they have the additional unit protect them, but Chinatown no. We hope in the future the Chinatown like the low house is like the Johnny Court and the Tyler Street. If we have the union protect them, I think will stable the long-time resident and the small business. In over 10 years, some like in the Johnny Court or Hudson Street and Harrison or Tyler Street, they have so many the landlords that change the new landlord. They push out the long-time resident. A lot of his family. They push out them, and then but they will use the unit to do the Airbnb or something. Even a small business. I know you can see Chinatown. Just like last month, one small business is closed. They will open a new. It's like the dessert or bubble tea shop. They are no more like the small businesses have the family small business in Chinatown. That's why I want to do the testify. Hope the city can concern about that. Okay, thank you. I think CBI will send you the comment letter soon.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Ms. Louise Baxter and then Ms. Sarita Ramakrishna. And then we'll go to the panel.
Okay. I think this civil rights put in it is very necessary because you look at the disparate impact. They say they're not denying blacks exactly, but this is disparate impact, how it affects minority and low income in EJ communities. And you're taking the opportunity away. I worked for the welfare, homeless families. I saw people shipped out to areas with no public transit. And they expected them to get off welfare, stay off welfare, but they don't do that. And I've seen so much destruction in neighborhoods and everything destroyed. What they call oriented development now is a bunch of what we call barrooms disguised as restaurants. And they've decided to destroy the community. Even some of the newcomers say there's lack of community. And they want more family housing because more people that stay makes more stability. And I'm thinking, I came to Boston when I was younger because in those days, 63, the interstate buses had to stop in every small town. So small town people could come I came down on trailways for job interviews and to find a place to stay. And in those days, I took home 40 a week. You could get a room for 10 a week. They subsidized UMass Boston 90%. In the 80s, that all changed. Like, us people have benefited. They're denying the same benefits and opportunities that others have. And that I kind of feel that people, low income, and when they cut off the buses in the small towns, some of the old people couldn't get to their doctor's appointments. So the life is that public transit and being nice is necessary because without a car, it's very hard to do anything and get ahead. The T in Boston and Massachusetts helped me get ahead, not to live free and die state, to get ahead. So, and I want to see other people. It's fairness and morals too. That we're supposed to have the minority groups and everybody now get equal rights. And this is sort of taking them away. And I had all the advantages, why couldn't somebody else? And I was lucky enough to buy when the prices went down. I just caught it was a short while, but, and of course some of the cheaper areas were white areas before.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sarita?
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony supporting the proposed text amendment to the Boston Zoning Code. My name is Saritha Ramakrishna, and I'm a policy analyst at the Conservation Law Foundation. We support the proposed amendment and specifically call attention to its relevance to environmental justice. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 and was designed to prohibit and eradicate housing discrimination. Through it, local governments receiving federal grants, including the City of Boston, became legally obligated to advance policies to undo the effects of housing discrimination and segregation through affirmatively furthering fair housing. However, more than 50 years after its passage, many communities, including the City of Boston, remain largely segregated. Residents of color continue to experience the harms associated with segregation, and these harms are many. We specifically want to call attention to the disproportionate environmental burdens that fall on communities of color that lack adequate housing choice. Where people live is a determinant of the quality of the air they breathe, their exposure to pollutants and toxic materials, and their overall health. Discriminatory housing practices have long perpetuated segregation and disinvestment, with direct impacts for the health of communities of color. As urban neighborhoods increasingly lack affordable options, these same residents are often forced to relocate to more affordable neighborhoods that contribute to poor health. This includes neighborhoods with low densities and poor transit access that are further away from jobs and educational opportunities. Health disparities based on race and ethnicity persist today, both around the nation and in Massachusetts. In the Commonwealth, a 2019 study by the Union of Concerned Scientists found that people of color are exposed to vehicle pollution at a rate 26 to 36% higher than white residents. Because of historic injustice and systemic exclusion from government programs that helped white households build wealth, households of color are more likely to be constrained by affordability. As such, one of the impacts of a lack of affordable health choices is the unjust and disproportionate exposure of these communities to long-term environmental harm. These conditions also put communities at risk from the immediate threats and long-term impacts of climate change. They render recovery from extreme weather events most inaccessible for these communities. Renter households whose housing choices are stymied by affordability may feel less confident in reporting housing and environmental violations. Relatedly, many of Boston's past planning and land use histories have harmed the health and quality of life of communities of color. Critically, disproportionate and discriminatory harm occurred even if these policies were not overtly racially motivated. For example, the Seaport is now one of the whitest and wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, resulting from city-approved developments with extraordinarily high housing prices and high parking prices. Not only does the city have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, examples such as these demonstrate the city's moral imperative to concentrate resources to correct past injustices, as they have an indelible impact on the livelihood of residents. Today, Boston requires new housing to alleviate high demand. Neighborhoods that previously experienced redlining and disinvestment, such as East Boston and Dorchester, are now seeing new development. However, the majority of units added to these neighborhoods are unaffordable to large swaths of the population, especially residents of color. While new development may not be racially discriminatory on its face, the effects of new development, often advertised as luxury housing and largely market rate, will result in racially disparate outcomes. Market forces will drive displaced households of color away from intact, inclusive, thriving, and resilient communities, and potentially towards increased environmental and health and climate burdens. Boston will become less diverse and more segregated as a result. Is it essential that the city codify fair housing protections into its zoning code as an environmental and climate justice strategy? Actions by the current federal administration to weaken fair housing protections increase the imperative that local governments step forward to make decisions to strengthen these protections. The proposal before City Council does just this. Under the proposed amendment, promoting racially, ethnically, and economically integrated communities for Boston becomes an explicit goal of the development review process. BPDA and oversight housing agencies must not only consider the potential discriminatory impacts of development processes, they must take affirmative action to promote fair housing. Enshrining fair housing obligations in the zoning code creates greater oversight over development, ensuring that these processes are both democratic and transparent. By creating a review process that evaluates land use and zoning decisions for their fair housing and racial justice implications, alongside other goals, the proposed amendment shifts the power to long marginalized communities where land use decisions have increased environmental and economic risks. Codifying fair housing protections is essential to dismantling historic injustice and prevent ongoing segregation. Committing to affirmatively furthering fair housing will benefit the health of Boston's diverse communities. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony.
Thank you very much. I would like to recognize that our colleague Ed Flynn has joined as well. Councillor Flynn, would you like to make any opening statement? Thank you, and just wanted to note that Councillor Anissa Sabi-George sent in a letter noting that she's absent from today's hearing because she's speaking at an urban education class at UMass Boston and attending an event on human trafficking, but she would like to thank the sponsor and offer her support for the proposed language. Codifying Boston's commitment to fair housing is an important and long overdue step. The area of redlining in Boston continues to impact the availability of housing as well as who has the income to access it. So she looks forward to reviewing the recording of the hearing online. Thank you. We'll hand it over to our panelists now. Margaret and Nadine, feel free in any order to introduce yourselves and make your statement.
Good morning. My name is Margaret Turner. I'm a housing attorney at Greater Boston Legal Services. Thank you very much for this opportunity to submit testimony in favor of the proposed order on behalf of the Boston Tenant Coalition and Greater Boston Legal Services low-income clients who are residents of Boston and profoundly impacted by Boston's zoning decisions and policies. As an initial matter, Greater Boston Legal Services and our clients wish to express sincere gratitude to Councillor Edwards for offering this proposed order. It is critically important, long overdue revision to the city's zoning code that will help bring the zoning code into compliance with federal and state fair housing requirements. In addition, Greater Boston Legal Services and our clients are grateful to the City of Boston, the Department of Neighborhood Development, Boston Fair Housing Commission, and the Boston Planning and Development Agency for engaging with the Fair Housing Steering Committee for over 2 years, the past 2 years, to develop a written assessment of fair housing in furtherance of the city's duty to affirmatively further fair housing. Greater Boston Legal Services and its clients feel strongly that this proposed amendment to the zoning code is an essential element of that assessment of fair housing that's in the process of creation. In short, the reason this amendment to the zoning code is critically important is that Boston already has an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, but we do not have adequate language in the zoning code to implement it. This amendment does not create any new obligation for the city or for the BPDA. It just will help ensure that we will meet the obligations we already have. I note that I'm also submitting written testimony with legal citations to judicial decisions, statutes, and regulations explaining the legal basis of this testimony. As others have said, the requirement to affirmatively further fair housing was a key part of the Fair Housing Act when it was enacted in 1968, nearly 50 years ago, over 50 years ago. The Fair Housing Act required HUD to affirmatively further fair housing, and then subsequent acts of Congress required grantee jurisdictions that were receiving federal funds through the Community Development Block Grant Program, Emergency Shelter Grants, and the Home Program to certify periodically that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing. And the City of Boston has been signing certifications that it is affirmatively furthering fair housing for many decades. As indicated in our written testimony, this certification has teeth. Several local governments have been sued under the Federal Fair Claims Act because of their alleged failure to do what they certified they were doing, affirmatively furthering fair housing. Boston needs to include affirmatively furthering fair housing language in the zoning code to ensure that the BPDA, as Boston's agent, is affirmatively furthering fair housing in all stages and areas of the zoning process. As others have noted, Article 80B3 of the zoning code already includes a list of 7 areas in which specific requirements must be met. And those areas include transportation, environmental protection, urban design, historic resources, infrastructure, site plan, and tidelands. This section on transportation alone constitutes 2 single-spaced pages. Of course, transportation and these other areas are important, but they are not more important than Boston's duty to affirmatively further fair housing. The proposed zoning code amendment would ensure that this key component of zoning is incorporated in the process. Failing to adopt this proposed zoning code amendment would be a disregard of the city's fair housing obligations and could be taken as a signal that the city is not taking its fair housing obligations seriously. In order to implement these obligations, BPDA should hire a fair housing expert, since this is a complicated area of the law and legally and factually, to identify necessary changes to current policies and practices, and in conjunction with the community process and officials from the city to advise it in fulfilling this duty to affirmatively further fair housing. In closing, I just wanted to read, as I was researching the written testimony, I looked back at a case from over 35 years ago in which the NAACP brought a lawsuit against HUD because HUD was not affirmatively furthering fair housing in its oversight over Boston's use of federal funds. And in that case, in 1983, the court notes, the district court after trial found as factual matters, this is 1983, that Boston has a history of racial discrimination in housing, that Boston suffers from a shortage of low-income family housing, that a higher proportion of Black than white families are renters, and a higher proportion of Black than white renters are families with children, and thus that the housing shortage impacts more heavily on Blacks than whites, that Boston's neighborhoods are racially separate, and that at least in part as a result of the lack of safe, desegregated housing in white neighborhoods, Black families find it difficult to move out of Black areas. These facts from 35 years ago remain essentially true today. Segregation and severe shortages of low-income housing remain critical problems in Boston. And unfortunately, in the case of recent integration in some traditionally segregated neighborhoods, has actually been tied to gentrification, as many others have stated, and has come at the cost of massive displacement of members of protected classes. The city must use every tool at its disposal to address these long-standing fair housing disparities, and that includes the city's zoning code. Boston must live up to its certification that is affirmatively furthering fair housing, and for that reason, the City Council should approve this order.
Thank you. Thank you.
I
just want to add a couple of things. The case that Margaret referenced, NAACP versus HUD, was started in 1978, and it was a result of the city of Boston not using its HUD funds appropriately to further desegregation and anti-discrimination activities. That case went on for almost 20 years, and in fact, it was the case that resulted in the Boston Fair Housing Commission having enforcement powers. It resulted in more Section 8 certificates for the city of Boston, and it resulted in Metro List, among other things. But I don't think we want to see 20 years of litigation, and I think this order and the change to the BPDA requirements are really very common sense and very easy to effectuate. Basically, this order asks the BPDA and all development activities in the city to take meaningful actions that promote racially, ethnically, and economically integrated communities and ensure that the city's obligations towards affirmatively furthering fair housing are met. That's pretty simple, and I think we have an obligation to the people in the city of Boston to ensure that fair housing is taken into consideration in all the housing decisions. Displacement, as other people have said, is a fair housing issue. And I think we have to ensure that any new developments not disproportionately displace people of color and other protected groups, and that the city ensures that all the large developments are required to have a real fair housing analysis and to ensure they don't result in further segregation of our city. And I just want to point out, as other people have, to the seaport, and as someone who was deeply involved in trying to ensure that the seaport would be a very diverse and welcoming community, I have a personal concern. I feel like I failed and the city failed, and we didn't do that in the seaport. And I think the city now has an opportunity going forward to ensure that those mistakes don't happen again. And I think City Councilor Edwards is really in the forefront of ensuring that that doesn't happen. And I urge the passage of this order.
Thank you both very much. We'll go to questions now from councilors. Councilor Edwards.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to note for folks, so based off of your testimony and also some of our research, we currently, in some aspects of the City of Boston, do implement furthering fair housing goals in DND and in BHA, right? And I think so some people may argue then that if the City of Boston is already meeting its obligations on those components, then why do we need a zoning amendment? And I would argue, I think the example is that even though we had those components and those obligations and were sued into doing that, we still ended up with the seaport. So it has to do with planning. There's a third leg missing in making sure that we are looking at what's to come and analyzing it before it's already here. So that's what I wanted people to understand. This is about how we are assessing developers and development when they come to the City of Boston. The zoning code sets standards for which they have to comply with. And I think Margaret mentioned 7 different ways, at least under 83B, in which developers are required to comply with transportation obligations, environmental, and so on and so forth. We're asking this to be another conversation going forward. So we can't say we didn't know. We can't say who would have thought the end result of the seaport would have happened. We were going to require that our experts do the analysis. And so part of the questions, and I wouldn't even call it pushback, there's a genuine commitment to want this to happen, but a lot of people are concerned about what it would look like. So I have some questions that might help us with that. The first is, And also, just to note, people, it's not just about racial segregation. It's about concentrations of wealth and poverty as well, which is also illegal under the Fair Housing Act. So one of the biggest things you mentioned, which was that we have an obligation, not just because of the Fair Housing Act, but through the funding that we receive as the City of Boston. We do get CDBG grants from the federal government, and with that, the jurisdiction for compliance comes with that. We talked about BHA, which is public funding housing. How does this obligation, or is there legal precedent for when we're talking about private development, and how the city's obligation to further fair housing impacts private development?
It's very clear that when the city signs its certification that it's affirmatively furthering fair housing, that means that the city is saying that it is doing so in every aspect of housing and planning for housing, every aspect, not just subsidized housing. And there are many cases, including the most long-standing case against Westchester County in New York, that are all about zoning policies. That case was about zoning policies, so there's no question. And in fact, in the most recent U.S. Supreme Court decision in inclusive communities, the court talks about zoning as being the heartland of fair housing concerns. So there's no question that the city's obligation to affirmatively further fair housing absolutely extends to zoning and issues about private development.
Thank you. With regards then to the zoning code is about setting standards for how in which you can develop in the city of Boston. And so one of the key conversations that we would have to have is what would those standards look like when we're talking about racial or economic or ethnic integration? How, even assume in the best case scenario, we want this, we have this in writing, we have now this standard. There's standards for transportation, there's standards for environmental, there's standards for all those different things like that. So how do you create a standard or even a point of analysis for racial, ethnic, and economic integration? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think one thing is that it would be a process, and it absolutely would need to involve fair housing expertise. It would be a back and forth, it would be collecting data, it would be doing analysis. One thing that comes to mind is that in California, the state has something called the Housing Element Law, in which cities and towns are required to look at their population and determine what kind of housing does this population need, including based on all different income tiers. And just to also mention that the Fair Housing Act, in addition to issues of race and ethnicity and national origin, it protects families with children and people with disabilities. And so that's something that comes to mind as an exercise that's very important. What is the Boston population? What does this population need in its housing? And start from there to figure out what to approve. But again, it would be a process and a back and forth and engagement with the community and with experts.
I also want to add that you would want to look in any new development, who's being displaced by that development? What are the racial, ethnic, people with disabilities, families with children, all the protected classes, seniors? What impact is that development having on those people? Are there disproportionate evictions as a result of the development, the new development that's being built? And then who, when the housing's built, who actually lives there? How does the community reflect the rest of the city? And are there affordable units in those new developments? And who are they affordable to? Are they affordable to some of our lowest income residents. So I think there are a number of criteria that one could look at the fair housing impacts, and I think this has been done, but I agree with Margaret, we need a fair housing expert to develop this analysis, just as we have a transportation analysis in the other areas.
Thank you. Have any?
You're good? Yeah. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Wu, and to Councilor Edwards for your work on this important issue. I just would like to say thank you to the panelists for being here and the residents of Boston for attending, but more importantly for their advocacy on this important issue for many years. I'm curious if you can walk me through, you know, with previous development in the South Boston waterfront, were you considering at all how you can connect the South Boston waterfront with neighborhoods around it, such as it's a short walk to West Broadway development, public housing, it's a short walk to the Chinatown community, a lot of poverty in both locations. What were you thinking in terms of advocating for both communities during the development of the South Boston waterfront, even including transportation access?
Well, that's interesting that you raise that, because I think we had maps done that in effect, the seaport was almost equidistant to Chinatown,
Right.
parts of the South End, as well as to South Boston. So we never saw it as just a community for South Boston.
Right.
And we thought it should be a community for all of Boston. But we never had the tools and the ability to hold those developers accountable. And, you know, I think it's on all of us. We didn't kind of fight hard enough, but I think this gives us another tool in newer developments to do that.
Yeah, thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, I thanked Councilor Wu and Councilor Edwards, but you know, they're doing excellent work on this issue, but should this have been done, you know, many, many years ago? And since it's done now, I'm glad it's being done now, but since it wasn't done many years ago, what impact did that have on the city?
I think you only have to look at the seaport to see that. You know, I think we could have had more racially, economically, ethnically diverse housing, not only in the seaport, but in some of the other more luxury buildings that we have. I work, Greater Boston Legal Services is near North Station. Mm-hmm. We have had like innumerable luxury buildings go up in the last 10, 12 years, and only the rich can afford those buildings, except for one, the Beverly. But other than that,
Most of the developments you have mentioned are located in my district, in District 2, South End, South Boston, Chinatown, downtown Boston, the North Station area. There's a lot of development taking place, but I do want to acknowledge even during the development, I do speak with city administration officials, and they are asking me, what can we do in terms of building more affordable housing for our immigrant community, for low-income residents. So I think we have made progress on this issue. Can I ask, why didn't we engage this issue before?
we didn't have Councilor Edwards here. I don't know.
If I may answer
Yeah.
some of the questions to the chair, to my colleague,
Yeah.
Councilor Flynn. So along with not just looking at the modern day example of when we don't plan looking at the impact on folks with disabilities, the impact on folks with children, looking at racial disparities, looking at ethnic and economic disparities, which is really important folks understand. It's a multi-data analysis. The impact, you can see that in the Seaport. You see it with the first time we raised an entire neighborhood with the West End. There was none done, right? You can look at the destruction and complete clean out of New York streets. You can look at how we decided to run a highway through Chinatown and the impact on our lungs, on many of your constituents who we both have deep relationships with, you especially. And you can see it on the impact of putting a highway also through East Boston, which may not have been in terms of racial diversity, but definitely was a working class neighborhood. And looking also at the location of an airport near that working class neighborhood, and literally raising the Wood Island neighborhood, and that is still a deeply pained topic for many folks in East Boston. So what we see is when we don't analyze and think deeper beyond the moment, we pay for it in higher rates in asthma, higher rates of COPD, the regular and continued segregation economically, ethnically of our neighborhoods. And to continue a system that does that is to be okay with that system. So I just wanted to make sure that, one, we did our history. We did write a report making sure that we went through all that, planning for fair housing and breaking that down in many of the conversations. And also, because the BRA was at the helm in many cases of these decisions, the BRA has a wonderful opportunity to take leadership in making sure that we undo those things.
Thank you. Councilor Flynn, you have another question?
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Wu, and thank you, Councilor Edwards, again, for your support on this, on your leadership, really. Just several weeks ago, my colleagues and I held a hearing on public health issues in many communities of color, and I was just reading this testimony, and I'll just highlight. The Union of Concerned Scientists found that people of color exposed to vehicle population at a rate of almost 36% higher than white residents. We were talking about that issue as it relates to whether it's Chinatown or Roxbury. You're located right off the highway system, the Mass Pike, the South Station area. What does the environmental impact have on fair housing, and is that factored in decision-making when you consider environmental issues?
I mean, absolutely. As Conservation Law Foundation representative described, environmental issues are critical, and they are fair housing issues. And the disparity in environmental quality that is experienced by members of protected classes as compared to those who are not in protected classes is very grave fair housing concern. And when the city certifies that it's affirmatively furthering fair housing, it is also certifying that it is doing so in the environmental realm, and so therefore needs to do so in the zoning context.
I just want to add that affirmatively furthering fair housing really means to look at all aspects of housing, not just the physical housing itself, but look at the health implications, the environmental implications, transportation, access to jobs, access to lending, and all sorts of things. And HUD, even in their detailed regulations around affirmatively furthering fair housing, specifies all of those. And I will say we did have community meetings all over the city around the assessment of fair housing, and people raise those very issues. And yes, it's a fair housing issue if all the people of color have to live in the most polluted and dangerous areas of our city.
And I'm glad that you mentioned, when you talk about the South Boston waterfront, the close connection to Chinatown and the South End and South Boston as well. That's how I deal with the South Boston waterfront, is the impact it has on the surrounding communities. and what impact will development in the South Boston waterfront have on Chinatown, on South Boston, on the south end? Are we able to build more affordable housing in these neighborhoods, including the South Boston waterfront, but can we build more affordable housing in Chinatown, since it's only a quarter-mile walk from the South Boston waterfront? And that's a discussion I continue to have with the administration. I think we are making progress. I had an opportunity to sit down with the mayor's team recently about the development taking place in Chinatown, and a lot of it is affordable housing, housing for low-income families, which we need. So I just want to say thank you for your testimony, but more importantly, for your leadership on this important issue as well.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn.
Thank you.
I want to recognize also, I see way up in the back, Councillor-elect Liz Breeden has joined us as well. So congratulations to our Councillor-elect. Looking forward to serving with her. So I know we have many folks who want to testify in another panel. I just have a few more questions. So first, actually, I wasn't even going to bring up the abolish the BPDA hashtag today, but we've gone there already. So I'm curious to hear the panelists' opinions. Do you think there's something about the structure of the way that the development process and the agencies are mapped out in Boston that makes it difficult or has been a barrier, going back to Councillor Flynn's question about why this hasn't happened before?
I'm not sure I can address that right now. I think that's something to absolutely think through in this process and to figure out what is the best way to ensure that that housing in Boston is fair housing for all residents.
It's fine. You don't have to use the A word.
Yeah.
It's okay. What liabilities specifically do you think the city is seeing now or risking, given the kind of lack of affirmative planning and furthering the mission of this?
I think we only have to look to the city of Westchester, New York, where they were taking federal funds for many, many years, and the city was saying, we are affirmatively furthering fair housing with that money. And in fact, they were not. They had totally segregated housing, lack of affordable housing. People of color were pushed to the most inferior housing in the worst neighborhoods. And some of the fair housing groups and eventually HUD, I think, brought a lawsuit under the False Claims Act, which says that you cannot falsely state that you're affirmatively furthering fair housing if you're not. Very interestingly, Ben Carson now wants to lessen the effects or the use of the False Claims Act, calling it the Monster False Claims Act. So I think the city of Boston does have some liability. If you say you're affirmatively furthering fair housing and the evidence by the statistical analysis and everything else shows that you're not. And I think the old NAACP lawsuit, which went on for so many years and really took a lot of energy in the city, is an example that could happen again. And I think we want to avoid that. And I think the advocates are willing to work with the city to figure out the best way to do that.
Got it.
Just saying that just underscores the importance of having this order pass and the amendment to the zoning code happen, so that it's clear that the city is undertaking its duty to affirmatively further fair housing in the context of zoning.
Great. So finally, and you kind of touched on this before, but just to be very explicit about it, what are the exact next steps that you would recommend to get there? Obviously passage, and not just by the council, but adoption by the BPDA and zoning commission. And you mentioned bringing on one staff position at least. What else?
I think we're not really sure if it should be a staff position or an outside consultant who monitors the fair housing activities.
For there to be a point
the
of accountability
VPGA,
somewhere.
But somebody with accountability. And I think the report that Councilor Edwards mentioned, the Fair Housing Report, is really good reading for everyone and really lays out some of this as well, the history, but also you need accountability. It's not good enough to just, amend our zoning ordinance and then not ever really look at whether it's being followed the way it should be. So I think there needs that monitoring, and I would think an outside person probably.
I think in just thinking of it as having a fair housing expert do a comprehensive review or audit of the city's zoning practices from top to bottom.
Thank you. Any other questions from my colleagues?
No.
Great. Thank you both very much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So I'd like to invite down the administration and BPDA representatives to take your seats on the floor. In the meantime, we'll bring up two folks from the public to testify who have since signed up, Lydia Lowe and Kathy Brown.
Thank you. Oh, let me just give you.
It should come on. Oh, I'll get it. Okay, excellent.
Thank you. I'm testifying on behalf of the Chinatown Community Land Trust to support the amendment of the Boston Zoning Code that requires that large project development review include an analysis and plans for meaningful actions to affirmatively further fair housing, analyze impediments, and prevent exclusionary displacement of Boston's vulnerable protected classes of residents. Chinatown CLT works to stabilize the future of Chinatown through community control of the land, development without displacement, permanently affordable housing, and shared neighborhood spaces. Because of its location at the epicenter of the downtown development boom, Boston Chinatown is an important case study for issues of development, displacement, and community stabilization. Since 2000, Chinatown's housing stock has doubled with the addition of 2,927 units in Chinatown and more than 2,500 new units on the periphery. For the first decade of the luxury boom, only 183 of these units, or 14%, were affordable. Since 2010, approximately 30% have been subsidized affordable units. The attached pie charts show the dramatic shift that's taken place in the composition of Chinatown's housing stock. A rapid escalation of rents, real estate values, and speculative activity followed, leading to a wave of evictions and displacement of the most vulnerable residents from privately owned, unsubsidized small row house properties, which were snapped up by investors to become cash cows as short-term rental properties. As a result of this sea change in the housing composition, the Asian population of Chinatown has gone from 69.7% in 2000 to 58.1% in 2017 as the population increased from 5,907 to 7,710. While both household and per capita income rose dramatically, disaggregating the data reveals that Asian incomes actually dropped. Therefore, we speak from experience when we say that we must have foresight when planning for major development and redevelopment of a neighborhood by analyzing the socioeconomic impact, ensuring that our new housing is not only for the privileged, and putting initiatives into place that will stabilize the community. This is kind of long, so I'm going to skip back to. Zoning is an important tool which has often been used to facilitate luxury development while extracting some community benefits, but the greatest benefits have gone to the luxury developers. The proposal to insert fair housing language and requirements into the zoning code is an important way to embed neighborhood stabilization into the process. We cannot simply count the number of housing units built and call it progress. We need to ask whose housing and whose Boston are we building? The proposal also updates our understanding of fair housing as a civil rights issue. In the past, neighborhood preference for predominantly white neighborhoods would have an exclusionary effect on people of color. But today, as communities of color face a displacement crisis, a tailored use of neighborhood preference can help to stabilize neighborhoods. We commend the city for launching a pilot diversity preservation policy to address this crisis, establishing a preference for current residents of a diverse working class neighborhood threatened with displacement for up to 50% of new affordable units in some projects. At the same time, policies like that need continuous fine-tuning to address the particularities of each neighborhood situation in real time, instead of relying on a one-size-fits-all set of calculations to determine when and how the policy should be applied. For instance, in neighborhoods where people of color may exceed the standard percentage, this should not render a project ineligible for the diversity preservation policy, but we should consider the particular history and development impact on that neighborhood. In neighborhoods like Chinatown, where displacement of the most vulnerable is already advanced, the preference should be extended to former residents displaced by eviction. When affordable home ownership opportunities come online in these neighborhoods, any income-eligible current resident should have a priority for those slots and the opportunity to remain in the communities they have built. We should keep such preferences in place so long as the neighborhood remains at risk of displacement, not only at initial rent-up or sale. I urge you to support the proposed fair housing amendment to the zoning code and to continue to develop the city's approach to using fair housing law in the service of helping communities of color remain in Boston. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kathy.
Hi there. So I'm Kathy Brown. I work with Boston Tenant Coalition, and the BTC strongly supports the passage of this ordinance. Margaret and Nadine and so many folks have had really powerful testimony about why this is so important. And I want to thank you so much, counselors, and Counselor Edwards for this amazing report that was done that really makes it kind of simplifies the issues, but talks to the importance, and it's a really helpful document. I hope that we're able to get it around throughout the city. So first of all, I want to, in addition to thanking you all, thank the City of Boston for all of their work that they've done around the affirmatively furthering fair housing. It's been a long process, I think, more than 2 years, I think more like 3 years or more. And we really appreciate all the work that they've done, the extensive community engagement that was done collectively with the city, with the Public Health Commission, with the Boston Housing Authority, and with community partners, drawing in over about 500 people to the various community meetings that were held as part of the assessment of furthering fair housing. And at those, there was about 14 different meetings that happened, some neighborhood-based and some more protected class-based. And it was very, very powerful. And sort of the two issues, and there was also a survey done that actually the Boston Housing Authority sent out to Boston housing residents, and they got, I think, 3,000 replies, which is just really impressive that was done. And the top issue, definitely in the meetings, was rising rents. And these meetings were, the focus was for people to speak to their concerns, the issues they face in trying to live in the housing in the community they choose, and speaking to discrimination and speaking to other issues that impact that. And rising rents and displacement was the #1 issue across the board. Another top issue was family status, like mothers not being able to place their subsidies. That is like one of the top housing issues is families being able to place their subsidies, or families just being able to locate housing in Boston because of discrimination and because of the high rents and subsidies these days not matching what the market rents are. Though we really appreciate the what the city has done around the fair market rent, that I think that is going to help a lot, and that's a great piece and actually, an important fair housing action that was taken. So we appreciate the city carrying on with the AFH despite the Trump administration and Carson administration putting the assessment of fair housing on ice, putting it on hold. And the city has agreed and has been meeting with us and hired James Jennings, Professor James Jennings, who's as a consultant to work with them on developing this plan and continuing to meet with us. And we really appreciate all the work of DND, the BPDA, Office of Fair Housing and Equity, and the Boston Housing Authority in doing that. So we think it's really critical that this ordinance be passed. And I believe that it's, as you mentioned in your report, Councilor Edwards, it is really following through with the executive order the mayor made back earlier part of this year. I went to actually the executive order over at the African Meeting House, where there was an executive order saying that all of the departments would be trained in using a race equity lens in their work. And that is a great executive order, and it feels like this ordinance is following through with that in relation to the BPDA and other citiations in relation to planning. Planning and development, obviously plays a major impact, as other folks have spoken about and how the impact of planning development on displacement, and especially displacement of folks in protected classes. In addition, another issue that you see, another key fair housing issue, is you see that the units that are being produced are mostly luxury units, and the market rate units, all of them are mostly studio and one bedrooms, which is not what is the need in terms of Boston families in this city. And so that is another mismatch, and it feels like having this order, the ordinance implemented, passed and implemented, could look at like that kind of planned development, which isn't for folks who live in Boston who are most impacted. So the other thing that I just want to say is we just really encourage Boston to follow other major cities, and you pointed this out in your report. Seattle, Baltimore being a couple you pointed out in the report that have done major work around using a race equity lens in planning and development. And actually, the Mayor Walsh had co-sponsored and held a special executive session with the Boston Alliance of Race Equity and the Government Alliance of Race Equity, of which I believe we're still members of, where people, that was held at Northeastern a couple of years ago. And at that, we got to hear, and actually people from BPDA and DND went to the sessions where planners from Seattle and community residents spoke to how they do planning with a really different orientation, and how impactful it has been. So again, I think it's following through with the executive order, learning from great work that's being done in other cities and using the tools that we have. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilor Edwards had a comment.
Yes, before we continued, I wanted to make sure we've been talking about this report. So just for folks, it's called Planning for Fair Housing, Addressing Fair Housing and Civil Rights Through Planning and Zoning. And the author is a Rappaport fellow named Kainat Khan. And I wanted to make sure she got credit for her incredibly hard work. She did interviews. She went back and looked at history. She talked to folks. And so I wanted to make sure she got credit for that.
Thank you. And similarly, transitioning to make sure credit is given where credit is due, I just wanted to say we appreciate and value all of your work, and I want to formally make sure I'm stating on the record that when and I think when others say abolish the BPDA, it is not about eliminating the very important functions that happen there or the positions that talented individuals like yourself are working hard in, but a recognition that we've seen over decades that the way that the system is set up, it actually undermines the work of talented individuals and any community-centered intention that comes out of it. So today I hope you see this as not a confrontational conversation, but one where we are seeking to understand your individual efforts and how we can talk about reforming a system so that it will actually support those intentions. So whatever order folks would like to start, feel free, and we'll just go on down the line.
Good morning. My name is Sonal Gandhi. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Boston Planning and Development Agency. I've been at the agency for 18 years now, and I'm thrilled to be here to speak with you today. I'm most thrilled to be here with our partners in the Fair Housing Committee, Margaret and Nadine. Kathy, thank you so much for being really active members in our conversations around fair housing. So thank you for being here today as well. I'm joined today by Tim Davis, our Housing Policy Manager, Brian Glasscock, our Deputy Director for Regulatory Planning and Zoning, and Willa Noah from the Office of Fair Housing and Equity. We're here today really to listen, as folks before us have testified and spoken about the fair housing is an important issue, and we have a steering committee working on it. We welcome all conversations regarding this topic, and we're really here to listen and answer your questions today.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to chime in at the outset? Okay. Councillor Edwards.
Great, thank you. So we have the zoning amendment pending right now, which would incorporate furthering fair housing into our zoning code. And so at this particular point, having looked at the zoning amendment, what is the conversation about how we go forward? Right now, for it to be part of the zoning code, we need it to be approved, or at least some of your support from the BPDA, and then for it to be ultimately implemented by the Boston Zoning Commission. So here we are with this proposed amendment. Where is the discussions going? Where do you see this amendment going?
Thank you. As Margaret and Nadine testified before us, there are quite specific next steps that need to be taken. It's not good enough just to have a zoning ordinance. What does it really mean? What are the standards that we apply as we look at these processes, as we look at studying the impacts of fair housing? So we believe, and we want to work together with the Fair Housing Committee to really establish these standards. We've talked about an outside consultant. We've talked about an expert in fair housing to really look at what we have in Article 80B currently, and really make sure that we're looking at it in a very responsible manner. We have some good examples of working with city agencies on topics that are not technically in Article 80, but are really part of the discussion, important part of the discussion. I want to give Councillor Flynn especially credit for really spearheading the accessibility conversation, and that's a really good example of how we worked with the city agencies on issues that, as we've heard in today's conversation, are also part of the fair housing universe. Commissioner McCosh at the Mayor's Office of Disabilities was at our board just last Thursday for a second update to the accessibility guidelines that we apply towards projects coming in front of us for review. And this is not just apply them, but also how do we take what's required by law, by the ADA, and supplement that so that we're providing, we're not just meeting the law, but we're also going above and beyond the law. So we have really, that came about initially in 2014. It was updated at the board in 2017 for the first update, and we just updated last Thursday, the 14th of November, last Thursday, the second update. So this is, a staff of folks, of experts. We're not the experts. Commissioner McCosh, Sarah, Patricia, and her staff are the experts, and we're looking to them to say what do we need to do to make sure we're not just complying with the law, but going above and beyond that, and making sure that everyone in our city, all aspects of life of persons with disabilities are taken care of and addressed. So we're looking, we have good examples of how we've done this in the past, and we're looking forward to continuing this conversation through this lens.
So I'm going to be more specific. Currently in the BPDA, what do you do to further fair housing and comply with the Fair Housing Act? What do you do right now?
Sure, of course. So let me talk a little bit about Imagine Boston 2030 and our planning department.
I appreciate that, but I really I think the question is really specific. What do you do currently on furthering fair housing? The legal obligations, as we heard from the two attorneys that there's a legal obligation to further fair housing. What current steps do you take to do that?
Okay, so I think the way to address that is looking at the BPDA holistically. As you know, since 2014, we have hired 4 community engagement managers to ensure that we have increasingly authentic participatory planning across the city. We are increasingly meeting with people in neighborhoods. We have a Chat with Planner series. We have our planning staff go to libraries, to neighborhoods. We have planners attend neighborhood functions, such as the farmers markets. We translate our materials, thank you, Councillor Flynn, and others here, into languages such as Spanish, Mandarin, Cantonese, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean, Vietnamese, and we provide interpretation services at meetings as requested. We also provide childcare at meetings as requested. This is really an effort to plan equitably for future development that is inclusive and allows for greater access to opportunity for all. That is really our mandate. And we are working very hard towards a community-focused lens on having these conversations. Some of the examples of how we've been successful in these processes is at Plan Dudley and in Plan Glovers. Just last week, we celebrated over 105 community engagements at Plan Mattapan. The Plan Mattapan's vision statement was developed with the community as a very hugely community-oriented process. So through our planning work, we're really looking at how do we look at all these issues, including fair housing, including making sure people are not displaced, including people are heard, their voices are authentically heard. And we're also able to put our property where our mouth is almost. The Plan Dudley, as you know, we've been able to achieve greater results for affordable housing and income-restricted housing, primarily because it's their city-owned land there. We've done some analyses, and these are all backed by analyses. We found that 73% of the housing stock in the Plan Dudley area was income restricted, and therefore at low risk of displacement. We also looked at, in Glover's Corner, we identified that within the study area, 57% of renters and 17% of homeowners are identified as housing cost burdened. So we're really looking at as we're doing our planning and increasingly doing planning, we currently have 11 full-scale planning initiatives, 18 small-scale initiatives, and we are participating in another 14 initiatives across the city that are led by other city or state departments. So, it's one of the, we're looking at this very, very carefully through a planning lens, absolutely. And we're also working with our partners in the Fair Housing Committee to make sure that we are understanding what the standards are, what the objectives are, making sure we have very clear standards and objectives. So when we apply this towards, in Article 80, it's part of Article 80, part of the zoning code, we're being very clear about what we're looking at, being very clear to developers as to what their expectations are. So we look forward to continuing that conversation.
So from that, I understand that you are doing you've increased community involvement in the, at least feedback and planning process. So that's, I think I understand that that's part of, or your answer to what you're doing to further fair housing. What are you doing then specifically to prevent segregation or concentrations of wealth or poverty during neighborhood planning? So now I know that folks are coming to the table. You have materials in more than one language. So now, the obligation, again, under the law, our legal obligation currently, is to prevent concentrations of wealth and poverty and to prevent segregation. So what are you doing in terms of planning? We just discussed that there are folks at the table. What else?
You want to talk about the neighborhood?
Okay. Hi, Tim Davis here, Housing Policy Manager. I want to talk about a couple of things that we're doing. One is, as Lydia Lowe already mentioned, we have the Neighborhood Diversity Preservation Preference. This is a pilot effort to see if we can actually provide a neighborhood preference specifically in neighborhoods that are already diverse. This was an effort between the City's General Counsel, Fair Housing, Department of Neighborhood Development, and BPDA to really thread the needle in terms of making sure that we're walking a fine line between what HUD's interpretations of fair housing law, others' interpretations of fair housing law, and an effort to provide a leg up for people who might otherwise be displaced from already diverse neighborhoods. We have established this policy and are applying it in a number of projects. We have been able to apply it on a couple of small projects in Chinatown, on projects in Glover's Corner, Jamaica Plain, and the JP Rocks area, and also we're going to be able to apply this to some projects in Dudley Square. This policy is one which does not have the stamp of approval by the state or HUD, and discussions with them to date have not been super promising because they're concerned about interpretation of fair housing law. So we are only applying this at this time to properties that are only city funded or fall under the inclusionary development policy, which are of course funded by private money. We are going to begin a process of looking at additional kinds of preferences that can address fair housing concerns while not necessarily triggering any concerns from HUD or from the state. So San Francisco has established some policies around preferences that try to get at the same issue without using the same exact location preference. We also, going back to the planning processes, there is an effort to look at displacement not only kind of from the perspective of what can the inclusionary development policy do, but also what can we do as a city as a whole to address displacement in areas where development might occur. And those include efforts that are not part of our agency, but fall under the Department of Neighborhood Development, such as the Acquisition Opportunity Program, ways to maybe fund that and make that a more fruitful process in terms of securing existing renters' housing in areas where there's a lot of development so that they can stay. And as you were aware, Councilor, we're also discussing ways in which we can bulk that up as one of the solutions to Suffolk Downs, to make sure that at the Suffolk Downs area, as that's developed, that we're not only trying to create more affordable housing in Suffolk Downs, but that we're trying to create more affordable housing nearby for existing residents.
So with regards to the mitigation is one of the things that the BPDA specifically extracts from development. And I think it's one of the leverage points we have when we're dealing with private developers as well. So do you take a racial equity or fair housing lens when looking at what you're getting in terms of benefits? Not just how much money you're getting, but who it will impact, who will be spending it, and how will this help further fair housing?
I can speak specifically in terms of the inclusionary development policy. We are working on an update of that policy at this time. And as part of that, we are certainly looking at data with a lens around fair housing and racial and ethnic equity to see how we can improve that policy in several ways to make that, improve the outcomes for that for people of color. And we also, over the last, I think it's been a year and a half ago now, working with the Disability Commission, we did actually set a specific goal for meeting the needs of those with accessibility needs, so that now that 15% of IDP units also have accessibility features. So that was a way in which we were also looking at a protected class in our work.
Does the BPDA agree with a lot of the testimony today that the number of units, the unit size, the affordability restrictions, and the specific use of mitigation funds have an impact on fair housing, that all those things impact access to housing and whether we're furthering fair housing?
Yes.
Okay. So when we're talking about a zoning amendment, if we were to make that a standard in our zoning code, and we already know that these are certain data points or certain areas that impact access to fair housing, would it make sense then to have that in the zoning code and to get to those standards so that going forward we have a lens to analyze development?
Yes, it would So
Excellent.
I think what we're saying, and when I'm being repetitive here, is we agree on the issue. We agree that this is an important issue.
That we should have racial equity, furthering fair housing as lens in our planning. We agree on that.
Of course. As we've heard from our partners, Margaret and Nadine testified to this, we are looking for clear objective standards so that we can apply them in a clear way. This is our first public conversation, Councillor Edwards, and thank you again for having this hearing. First public conversation, there has been a lot of conversation about this with a lot of people who really care about this, and we welcome them all to the table. We're looking at the next steps, is it a staff person who is on our staff? Is it an outside consultant? Where is it housed? Which city agencies will be part of the conversation? In order to be successful, we really would like to look at those next steps and make sure that we're doing them in a responsible manner. Yes.
So what I'm hearing is that we're trying to get to the certain standards for compliance with further fair housing and planning?
I think there's a very robust working group that is put together that will help us get to these standards.
For planning, zoning.
For zoning.
And furthering fair housing.
Correct.
And so if those standards are then made clear, what would be in the way of then having this zoning amendment?
So in order for us to have a zoning amendment, we need to have very clear standards. And that's what we're looking for at this point.
And just for folks to understand, where I wouldn't say we disagree, but where we're dealing with a conversation, it's really cart, horse, or chicken and egg. My position is that we should pass and implement this zoning amendment and then set up a time frame for the discussion of what the standards would be to make sure that zoning amendment comes to fruition. That is my position. And my colleagues, and they are my colleagues, we work together, this is not an oppositional conversation, are dealing with standards regularly in zoning. And what I hear from not just them, but other folks, is they'd like to see what are examples of clearer standards that would support this zoning amendment, very likely before we put the zoning in. And so that's where the conversation's happening. Again, this is not a contentious one, but that's where the difference is. And I wanted that to be very clear. Not different.
Take effect later date.
Yes, so my suggestion is pass the zoning amendment, have an effective date that's much later, continue the conversation, hire the professional, come up with the standards, and now we're ready to go. They're not necessarily disagreeing with that. That is just the conversation that we are having. And I wanted that to be very clear so that you're not hearing from the administration that they disagree or don't want to further fair housing. That is not what my colleagues are saying. The question is the process, and that's what this conversation's about. So I wanted that to be clear. We are friends in this room. Also, I wanted to point to, and I'm going to William. I want to make sure I say, Onuaha?
Good job.
Whoa.
Good job, Counselor.
So, and I think he has also a role to play in this. He is head of our fair housing.
Yes, ma'am.
For the city of Boston. And so I'm curious about your role in this conversation and how you can take leadership in this going forward.
So my role is simply, I am the Executive Director of Fair Housing and Equity. Many of the partners who you see in the room today are folks that we meet with regularly and talk to, and we are all engaged in a working group, as you know, of AAF, or Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. Those conversations are currently happening as we try and figure out what more we can do as a city to affirmatively further fair housing. My specific role is, as the Office of Fair Housing and Equity, we investigate all any discrimination claims in housing in the city of Boston, whether it's banks, landlords, lenders, or whomever, or even city department, or anyone who is a housing, both public and private housing providers. Any complaints of discrimination, we investigate those cases. We bring them before the Boston Fair Housing Commission, and if there's a cause of probable finding, issue sanctions, and a bunch of other things that we do in order to combat discrimination in fair housing, or in housing in general, period, throughout the entire city. So that's the role we play on a day-to-day basis.
And so part of this new conversation is understanding we have that obligation,
yes.
But how are we as a city going to proactively prevent these segregation, concentration of wealth or poverty, and that's what the other legal obligation to the City of Boston is under the Fair Housing Act as well. And so today's conversation is how we marry that with our planning, because we've seen, we have it in D&D, we have it with BHA, and still without that third major piece, you can end up with a concentration of wealth, a racially segregated neighborhood that, well, I mean, as the seaport looks like that. So even when we do meet obligations in some aspects, when we are dealing with especially open spots where we have the opportunity to lead as a city, if we don't, it doesn't happen naturally. And so I'm curious about your role as to whether you would be that expert in the fair housing that we'd be working with the BPDA. Would you be part of helping to bring that expert to the BPDA to really help deal with the planning and setting up standards and data?
I see. So as far as an expertise, I would say that the role that we would play is we would help shape the conversation.
Okay.
We would help provide whatever data we had that showed where discrimination was taking place in order to further the conversation. As far as experts, I think there's fair housing, there's a number of ways to address fair housing. It's not just only through our office. There are folks who we have not had the ability to speak with that are also our sister agencies that we would need to pull in to this conversation in order to comprehensively really, really have a fruitful conversation and come up with a fruitful plan as to how we are going to address these issues.
Great, thank you very much. I'll go to Councillor Flynn for questions.
Thank you, Council Wu, and thank you to the panelists for being here and for the important work you're doing in the city. Just wanted to follow up on a couple of questions that Councilor Edwards discussed. But does the proposed changes fit into the city's plan for building more affordable housing, for fair housing? Is that something you guys agree on in this document, that fits in with the city's plan? For furthering housing for low-income residents, families, fair housing issues?
I've been the main person sitting at the meetings about the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing document, and it's been important all along that I've been at that table to make sure that our work is dovetailing with the work of the Department of Neighborhood Development and the BHA, and looking at how all three agencies together are meeting those needs. There is the Housing Boston 2030 report and its update in 2018, which really calls out for making sure that we are meeting the housing needs of a range of incomes for the city. And my work with the Inclusionary Development Policy is certainly part of the discussion about how that policy fits into all of those programs, and how each program can and does meet the needs of different incomes, which, given our city's demographics, directly relates to how we are meeting the needs of protected classes.
So it does mean,
yes.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out, following up again on my colleagues, what does the city administration need to do to work some of these issues out on the zoning changes? Is it a working session? Is it the working group? Is it sitting down and discussing it? How do we finalize these outstanding issues that seem to be there, but they seem to be very minor? But how are you guys going to address that?
I would say all of the above, what you just mentioned, yes.
Okay. So it's an ongoing
It's an
discussion.
ongoing conversation, yes.
Okay. And I know you talked about the inclusionary plans that you had of including our immigrant community, our residents that may not speak English, so I do want to acknowledge the progress that BPDA has made in terms of language access, reaching more residents of Boston, especially those that may not speak English. What are some of the challenges that we have in terms of reaching more people in their own language? Do we have to hire more city employees that speak various languages? Are we doing enough outreach to hire diverse candidates? What are some of the things that we can do to bring people that are bilingual into the administration?
Thank you. I actually speak 4 languages besides English, so I'm one of those people.
Okay.
So I think, as I mentioned earlier, we've been very actively hiring people whose very jobs are to reach into the community and have people who might not have traditionally participated in conversations be part of the conversation. These community engagement managers are out in the community every day, really looking for people to participate in the process. Councilor Flynn, I know you've been out in Chinatown with some of our staff and have had meetings where there's been interpreters available. And so, I'm lucky enough to work in this administration. I've used my language skills to help people looking for housing, and we are continuing to look at staffing, look at how we reach communities in ways, the immigrant communities, people who might not be able to make it to meetings because they have childcare needs, people who might not be able to make it to meetings because they're at a different time, not in the evening. So what other times can we offer meetings? Where else can we go physically be present so that the folks who are in the neighborhoods can come and talk to us? I talked about the neighborhood planners going to neighborhood functions such as farmers markets and tree lightings. Those are not traditionally places where historically you've seen neighborhood planners, but our neighborhood planners really kind of pride themselves on knowing the neighborhoods and that they're planning for. Like I said earlier, there's been 105 community engagements in Mattapan, and we celebrated that last week with the community. There was a meeting last night in Dudley that was really well received, and so it's we're really focusing our efforts on making sure that we're reaching folks who we want to be part of the process and can participate.
As it relates to childcare needs, how do you publicize that in terms of, if there's a notice going out, a public notice going out of an upcoming meeting in 2 weeks at a certain neighborhood, is there a note on that brochure that childcare will be available?
I need to go back and look at the notices, as I don't want to give you an incorrect answer, but I know it's provided as requested for sure.
Could we consider, instead of having it per request, could we have it as part of the BPDA traditional notification process of notifying residents of upcoming neighborhood meetings, and on that same brochure, making a note that childcare would be provided, and if you are interested, to call this number?
Sure.
Just so that we're doing a little bit more outreach on being more actively engaged to let parents know that there is childcare available?
Sure.
Okay. Then William, I just had a follow-up question from your comments. Are we tracking developers or construction companies if they have a history of discrimination in the workplace, or not renting, or not being a good neighbor? Do we have a list of those companies that traditionally have not lived up to their potential of making sure Boston's a city for everybody? And if we don't track it, or we do track it, what are your thoughts about that?
So, thank you, Councilor. We do track, we do have a record of all discriminatory cases with developers or landlords or whomever, even banks, lenders. So the record does exist, but to say that we're actually tracking, I'm not sure that's the most appropriate way of saying that, but what I would say is that we certainly keep those records. We have those records. So if at any point, and it's all public information, so if anyone ever wanted to see or asked us to produce a record of said company or development management company, bank, what have you, we would be able to produce that quite easily.
If a company traditionally has a poor record on being inclusive, they have a poor record on discrimination issues, they have a track record of discrimination issues, I'm not saying do we track them, but do we at least know that before a developer is selected, a contractor is selected, a proposal is selected? Are all of those issues factored in as it relates to discrimination?
Well, we would know that, but as far as before they're awarded a project or anything like that, we're not involved in that particular process. We deal strictly with the Boston Fair Housing Commission. The commission obviously has records of said individuals, and I would even argue increases penalties and fines as, you know, said individuals would come before them over and over.
Does the BPDA work with Williams' office in not tracking, but just knowing who has a history of poor practices, poor outreach in the community? They have a history of discrimination. What type of dialogue do you have with Williams' office in ensuring that companies that have a history of discrimination, that we at least know about it?
We don't have anyone here directly from Development Review today, but I would suggest that that is certainly a place where we could probably do more in terms of working with the Office of Fair Housing and Equity. There are some more informal things that I think happen, including I do work with the Affirmatively Fair Housing marketing process, and there is certainly, they have a list of marketing agents that have, quote unquote, successfully completed lottery processes following those guidelines. And so those are the kinds of lists that are positive lists that are given out that developers use to sometimes identify who they're going to use for marketing agents. So in that respect, there is some connection. There is certainly, we also don't have anyone here directly from our real estate side, but they, given when it's a BPDA-owned parcel, there are certainly things they can do in addition to what we do in development review to see if a developer is a responsible developer, and I know D&D does some of those efforts.
And then one final question. I'm glad you brought up the subject of disability access and making sure persons with disabilities have equal access in housing issues. And I know the commissioner, Commissioner McCosh, is doing excellent work on this issue, working closely with BPDA. What more can we do to make sure that persons with disabilities are part of the process, are not discriminated against, and what type of outreach can we continue to have on that issue? And again, I know you are making great progress on it, but that's a very important issue.
Yeah, and thank you again. Commissioner McCosh and her staff have been incredibly wonderful partners as we look at this issue. And I think we'll be looking to their staff to make sure that the outreach is done, to make sure that all the concerns that they've addressed, the checklist and guidelines that they provided are on our website. They're very clear. They're very they're long and they're lengthy, but their staff is really good about making sure that they are part of all the processes that we have in Article 80, come to scope determinations, really provide really provide guidance to developers as to this is what you're doing, but you know what, you need to do a little bit more. And her staff has been wonderful to work with. They actually came and presented to our planning and development review staff way before we went to the board, so that our staff is also trained as to what to expect and what to ask for and what to look for when it comes to projects. And this is the entire planning department, the entire development review department. So not just the folks that who are approving projects, and but it's also the staff that is looking at the design, and urban design is looking at all the impacts. Our urban design staff is a big part of the planning department, and so as our urban design reviewers look at projects coming in, how wide are the sidewalks, and what are the vertical, the ways of vertical movement? Are the elevators provided at key areas? So we make a very concerted effort to make sure that every part of the agency where a developer might come in or a project proponent might come in has heard what Commissioner McCosh and her team are working on and what the checklist looks like. We literally walked through the entire checklist at our meeting, it's long, but didn't read every single word in that meeting. But this is what the checklist looks like, and this is how it's evolved over time. So it's a living, breathing document. There are very clear kind of requirements under law as to what needs to get done, but we're taking that above and beyond and evolving it so that as developers come in, as Commissioner McCosh and her staff look at these, how do we better, what did we miss last time and how do we better that? And that's taken to our board for approval as well, and our board is very, very supportive. Commissioner McCosh presented the update to the board herself last week with her staff, and we're incredibly incredibly grateful and proud of her work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Zakhem, I want to recognize that Councillor Josh Zakhem has joined us. Do you have any statement or questions for the panel?
Not at this time, thank you.
Thank you. So just to reinforce the understanding from earlier in your discussion with Councillor Edwards, what I heard was that you all agree with the idea of a zoning text amendment at some point, and the question is just a slight need for more discussion on the timeline of it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we agree that we're here to listen to what the issues are, what the concerns are, and we're absolutely willing to work with all our partners to make sure we can get all the tools necessary to get this done.
Okay. And so I don't want to belabor any of the points that were made already. I'm just curious. So Brian, for example, in your role that was newly created under this administration to focus on zoning, what have been, and this is 2014 or so, you've been in this role, what have been the main focus areas, and how does this affirmatively furthering fair housing fit into how your review will continue to work?
That's a really huge question, so I will try and compartmentalize it into sort of relative elements. When Mayor Walsh came in, he was fairly fresh off of dealing with some rezoning as a state rep in Dorchester, and had been really frustrated with the way that process had worked, and thought that we could do better. The zoning code is almost inaccessible for most people. It's about 3,500 pages. There are 90 articles. It's about 50 years old. He thought we could do a better way, do this in a better way. And so one of the things that he had asked me to do was look at opportunities to clarify the code, to consolidate things, to make it more user-friendly. At the same time, we embarked on these strategic planning initiatives in neighborhoods across the city, initially with Jamaica Plain Roxbury and Dorchester Avenue. And it sort of marked a turning point in the way BPDA, I think, and the planners had approached zoning. Traditionally, zoning accomplishes a couple of different things. It just describes the height and density and dimensions, what the building, how big the building's going to be, regulates the uses in the buildings, tries to decide what other things need to happen, like requiring off-street parking or places to store dumpsters and trash and recyclables. and then it prescribes a process for development review. And that's primarily what Article 80 is really it's a process that shows how smaller projects, those between 20 and 50,000 square feet, or larger projects that are 50,000 square feet and above, are reviewed by the city. It also acknowledges that, and I think Councilor Edwards mentioned it in her opening, planned development areas. In planned development areas, there's a recognition that when you have a site that's 1 acre or more in size, it represents a unique opportunity to think about how we develop that. If we had a 1 acre site and the underlying zoning said that it could all be single-family houses, that'd be an enormous missed opportunity to create additional housing, to leverage that additional development potential into more and better community benefits.
So has the 3,500 pages and 90 articles changed significantly in the last couple years at all?
I think we've been able to do a couple of really important things. One, we recognized that there were some small business initiatives, bakeries and things like that, that were forbidden in some areas, in commercial districts. Because it's a patchwork, every neighborhood is different than the last. We're able to come to some agreement about there are some things that should be allowed citywide.
Take out, et cetera.
Art galleries and bakeries. And
when were those changes made?
Those changes were made in, I want to say this is 19, was that 2015, I believe?
Okay.
And so look back a little bit.
Since 2015, it sounds like your team has been mostly focused on furthering these Plan.av, Plan JP Rock style initiatives rather than going back to the zoning code, or?
So the Plan JP Rocks as well as Plan.av represented a shift in the way we looked at those areas rather than having very sort of rough descriptions about how high and how far set back and densities. We use the urban design tools that we have through the zoning code to shift to something that's more akin to what they call form-based code. Essentially deciding sort of what do you want the urban environment to look like? Creating space for public realm so you can have wider sidewalks. For instance, Dorchester Avenue, narrow sidewalks right now, but if you, by requiring bigger setbacks, you can get a bit better public realm, and requiring developers to build that public realm, and in requiring them to step back the buildings so you create view corridors. So it began to shape what the buildings were looking like. At the same time, through the planned development area process, we recognized that having those greater heights and densities creates value, and the city and the community should share in that value that's been created in terms of higher rates of affordable housing, deeper subsidies, in the case of Plan.av, including open space, additional open space benefits, because there aren't any right now. There's no parks there.
Was there any report done or kind of summary of ways in which your team thought the zoning code should be amended or consolidated or streamlined at all?
We've been working at that through the sort of the lens of the strategic planning areas.
Okay. So just nothing kind of citywide, just kind of as each of the geographic areas?
We definitely look at it through the terms of the
Imagine Boston.
Imagine Boston 2030, as well as other planning initiatives, the Plan for Boston Housing, the transportation plan, the accessibility plan.
Okay, I'm just asking all this to, I know, and we've worked really closely together on the small business stuff in particular, and I know how much work has gone into that.
So I can't not mention our work with Councilor Flynn in South Boston, which represented another important step. One of the things that we looked at was in many neighborhoods, the zoning doesn't reflect what the existing condition is. We have zoning limitations that are more strict than what's there. And we saw in South Boston that most of the housing there, most parcels were in an FAR of about 2. or 1.9, I think.
Are you
was the
talking about
average.
lifting the iPod and
So
putting an
in
article?
working
I don't remember
working
what
with the
the number
council on the iPod, everything was going to the Board of Appeal, which didn't make a lot of sense exactly because then things were getting approved. So we tried to match the zoning to what the existing condition is and what the community sort of felt was, what was acceptable. And so that if you build within what zoning allows, you can do that as of right, and people should be satisfied with that. If you want something in addition, then you need to go to the Board of Appeal, and that we're going to make you justify those variances that you need. And it was a long process, and a lot of back and forth, a lot of different opinions, but at the end of the day, we're able to find something. So it made the zoning code more reflect the existing conditions and respect the community's concerns.
I'll leave to Councilor Flynn if he wants to jump in on whether his constituents felt like the zoning changes were reflective of what the needs were, but he certainly doesn't have to. Okay. So I'm just asking all this to understand, because we're talking about not implementing this and passing this because you're saying that we need to have more of a process and zoning review and all this. And there's been a mechanism for zoning review for the last 5 years or so that has resulted in some changes around small business and these planning initiatives that are corridor by corridor or neighborhood based. But I'm not sure that looking at what work has happened to date is informative for the process that you would be asking us to postpone passage for.
So actually what I was going to add to what Brian said, I think partially answers this question. Brian neglected to talk about some of the work that he and I are doing together on the home rule petition for inclusionary development, to put inclusionary development into zoning. That is a real effort by us to make sure that once we have the inclusionary development policy in zoning, it opens the door for really making some more substantial changes. Until we have a tool like that in zoning, we're kind of stuck with keeping with our existing zoning so that we trigger IDP on buildings and specific projects. So that's an important kind of citywide tool that we need to kind of really move forward on these larger questions of simplifying zoning.
And I have to recognize Council Edwards and her staff and a lot of folks in this room. We spent some quality time working on that earlier this year, and to my mind, if we can get that to happen, that will put Boston head and shoulders above most everywhere else in the country, and it unlocks a lot of opportunity here to leverage even more of the value that's being created towards affordable housing and other things that our communities need.
Thank you. Councilor Edwards, do you want to respond?
100% agree that the IDP amendment was a great deal of work, involved a lot of people, involved many reports, and I appreciate the leadership and the back and forth, and we got there. So that speaks to that we can get things done. But even with that getting done, what this amendment would do is say, in the lens in which we reap those benefits, we have got to analyze all aspects. That yes, we may increase the percentage of IDP because we are the city of Boston and we passed that home rule petition, and we may do it on our own. But with those benefits coming in, with that mitigation coming in, with that analysis being implemented, if we do not do it with a racial or disability or class or with these equitable lenses, we could still end up with a lot more of housing that is not reflective of the needs of the residents of Boston. And so that's why I don't see them as too different or even on the same plane of conversation. One is about increasing affordability. One is about making sure that when we do any increase, it's actually equitable. And so that's why I think this amendment is so important. And just to summarize, and I have to say thank you so much, Councilor Flynn, your analysis and your point about looking at bad actors. I actually think that should be part of something that's happening now. If you have data that demonstrates who is discriminating in the city of Boston, and that data isn't given or isn't shared or isn't analyzed by the folks who are part of planning, there's a disconnect. And we noticed that there was a disconnect, for example, when it came to wage theft analysis and our Boston jobs policy. that you could be looking at who is not paying their workers in one vein. If that's not communicated to who should be getting the contracts in the other vein, then we have a disconnect. So this is a wonderful opportunity to marry those conversations. If you have data about not just bad actors and discrimination, but really in the lens of looking at who is going to likely lead us or partner with us in terms of being a more equitable city. If you have developers there, private or whatever, and you're part of our analysis, hopefully when this passes, not hopefully, when this passes, and we are required to look at who is going to further fair housing, who's going to be that partner, and what standards we're going to hold them to, the best way to say is, well, you've actually hurt furthering fair housing efforts in Westchester. You've not done a good job with this. So part of our analysis in looking at your zoning and how you're going to operate in Boston is looking at how you've operated before. I think that's a wonderful data, and if we have it, point and conversation. So I wanted to, again, echo the thanks to Councillor Flynn by saying that should be there, because that's readily available. If it's public information, we should be analyzing it right now. So if we're looking at developers for Suffolk Downs or for the government center or looking in the waterfront, look at their records, or we should be. And I didn't hear that we are in planning. The other thing is we have data points for size of the units. We have data points for disability or access. We could look at also affordability. So there are already things that we could be looking at that help us with that conversation and analysis for furthering fair housing. So I, again, would echo, let's get this amendment done. Let's build in enough time to figure out what that process will look like in that analysis, and then make sure that by that date, we as a city are analyzing our planning with equity in mind.
Thank you. And my last question is, so just, obviously the council and the administration play different roles in the sausage making process. And so I think there's always an impact when the council sort of puts forward a proposal, maybe even passes it even before, in this case, it would go to other agencies for further iterations and response. Is there anything within the text of this as is, say the council was going to pass this before the end of the year, recognizing that then the ball would be in BPDA and Zoning Commission's court to make any moves, then it wouldn't be implemented with our passage. Is there anything within the current language that you take issue to or would want amended specifically?
I think we'd be looking at that through working sessions and conversations with folks like you and the folks in the room who are our partners. So, at this point, we'd be looking at having working sessions and conversations with the folks who have been our partners to date.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Colleagues are good? Okay, thank you so much to our panel. Feel free, I know you have very busy schedules, feel free to watch from the stands if you'd like. But we appreciate your time, and we'll transition now to the rest of public testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to call up Bethany Lee, Amanda Govin, Markeisha Moore, and Mike Prokosh.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Bethany Lee. I'm an attorney and the director of the Asian Outreach Unit at Greater Boston Legal Services. We work in close collaboration with community organizations like Chinese Progressive Association and Asian American Resource Workshop in Chinatown and in Dorchester. We run legal clinics in Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Mandarin 3 times a week in each of those neighborhoods. And we represent tenant associations and Chinese and Vietnamese tenants in multi-unit buildings in each of those communities that are at the front lines of displacement in this city. Zoning might not be a cure-all to gentrification and displacement in Boston, but it's a crucial piece of the puzzle. All too often, zoning seems technical and out of reach of the average resident. But the outcome of zoning decisions is deeply felt by neighborhoods and can lead to disparate impacts on communities of color. My experience in defending and planning against displacement due to zoning decisions has taught me that cities can powerfully use zoning as a tool to aid or to ignore communities of color. For years, I worked as a civil rights attorney in New York City, representing community organizations and Black, Latinx, and Asian American residents and workers in low-income communities of color fighting against displacement. I worked at New York at a time when the city was undergoing hundreds of major rezonings throughout all 5 boroughs. The Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy at NYU had conducted an analysis of the first several years of zoning. And what it had found is that more low-income communities of color when communities where there were fewer home ownership possibilities were upzoned. So more development was allowed in those communities. And communities that were more white and had more homeowners and more affluent had been downzoned. So they were protected from development in those neighborhoods. I worked with and represented residents in community groups in Manhattan and Brooklyn's Chinatown, fighting against the disparate impact of zoning decisions in low-income immigrant neighborhoods. Environmental laws in New York required analysis of both residential and commercial displacement due to the rezonings. While this analysis was useful, it applied only after zoning plans had been made. To more effectively consider the fair housing implications of zoning decisions, incorporating fair housing analysis into the zoning code and planning is critical. The amendments offered to the zoning code by Councilor Edwards are an important step in this direction. In addition to these amendments, considering other areas of the zoning code that lead to inequity is also important. For example, Chinatown is the only residential district in Boston that doesn't have additional zoning protections. Every other residential district in Boston has zoning designations like row house zoning or multifamily zoning that limit floor area ratio or the number of building units. These designations provide for more protection against inequitable development, but Chinatown's residential row house streets don't have these protections. Amending these and other parts of the zoning code with an eye towards fair housing are important to ensuring that Boston neighborhoods retain the diversity that has become the hallmark of this city. I also actually have a couple of responses to some of the questions you were asking earlier, if I have a couple minutes to do that.
Yeah, take 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. So in addition to fair housing experts, I would advise looking more closely at planning experts who have also focused on displacement. Tom Angotti is someone in New York City that I work closely with, and
Could you repeat the name?
Tom Angotti, T-O-M and then A-N-G-O-T-T-I, is someone I work closely with in New York, and I think he would be an amazing person to consult with on some of these issues. I think in addition to the zoning code, looking at environmental laws that Councilor Flynn had been talking about are an important piece of the puzzle. It's not the cure-all, but I think all of it together is helpful for looking more closely at the impact that development has. And I think the accountability cannot be stressed enough. I think what we were seeing in New York is that there were lots of laws in the book that required consideration of displacement, but when it all came down to it, at some point when the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted, it's not like displacement was actually being considered despite what the laws actually required. And kind of your earlier question, Councilor Wu, about abolishing BPDA, whether we're talking about abolishing or not, what I do think is no city has gotten right this process of community involvement and community feedback. And I think we can talk all we want about interpretation and childcare, and I think that's incredibly important when we talk about access to planning and the planning process. But what it doesn't actually do is take into real consideration what the community feedback is, because I think if we were ensuring that we had a process that considered community feedback, we wouldn't be seeing the types of luxury developments in all the different neighborhoods that we're seeing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amanda?
Good morning. My name is Amanda Govan. I am a residential volunteer for Reclaim Roxbury. I am a parent that is also involved with the Roxbury Dorchester Mattapan Parent Council. I'm also on the parent council at Bridge Boston Charter School, which my 7-year-old goes to. I liked how you said earlier about bridging the gap and actually recognizing the disconnects and actually making it more connected. 2 disconnects that I just recognized about 10 minutes ago. They sat here, they said their piece, and we all have busy schedules, not just them. And for them to just say their piece and just pick up and leave, and then we say our piece and they're not here to hear any of it, that's one major disconnect. The second disconnect, for you to say that we're all friends in here, but we're not really hearing the truth on any kind of zoning particulars that they really just described, I don't feel like that's fair. That's the second disconnect. The third disconnect, where he's really sat here and talked about they provide childcare, which I can tell you for a fact that they don't. The 2 zoning deep dive meetings that they had at the Kroc Center in Dorchester and the spontaneous celebrations over in Jamaica Plain, I brought my 7-year-old and my 3-year-old daughter, and those are arrangements that I had to make beforehand, 2 weeks in advance. So I can tell you off rip right now that when it comes to being friends in this room and actually sharing actual resources, one thing we need to share is the truth. One thing that we need to recognize is the truth. Zoning protections has not been in brown and black communities' favor since the I would say since before I was created, because I wasn't born to 79. So I would say maybe the late 70s, early 80s, maybe somewhere just the 60s. And from my understanding, even so much as now, when it comes to gentrification, a lot of our neighborhoods are looked at as a lot of blight, a lot of dirty streets, a lot of non-neighborhood pride, and I don't necessarily feel like that's fair, because a lot of the people that are involved with a lot of this zoning and all of this other things that are happening in my community, because I'm on the South End Roxbury line, I would say it's a lot of people on the outside looking in, and they're just driving in here for 8 hours and they drive back out. They don't necessarily live where I live. They don't deal with what I deal with, and they don't interact with the people that I interact with, whether it's brown, Spanish, black, poor, white. At the end of the day, even though we're all a human, this makes a difference as far as where you live, what kind of job you get or don't get, because my last employment was January of 2010. This coming January 25th of 2020, I have been employed in 10 years. How I survived to be able to raise 2 children is beyond me. But one thing that really has to be recognized, there's been major disconnects in the brown and the black community for far too long. And for these folks to sit here and say that they're recognizing this and dot af this and small sidewalks, at the end of the day, none of us in here can live on a sidewalk. None of us in here can live in an alleyway. None of us in here can live in a cardboard box. We have to really recognize and know that brown and black communities also need to be protected by zoning, not just just a little bit here and there, and oh yeah, we're pulling up this skyscraper here, and a lot of these developers don't want to take an honest look into Codman Square, an honest look into Talbot Ave, an honest look on the whole strip of Blue Hill Ave. I'm talking about the start of Dudley and Blue Hill all the way down to Mattapan Square. There's one grocery store in Mattapan, one. As big as Mattapan is, even the Mattapan High Park line, 2 grocery stores. You could basically call that a food desert. Yes. I've lived in a lot of these communities even way before I even had children. And I can tell you as of now, they could come in here and sit and say all of these fancy stuff all they want to. Until they actually recognize that they're not protecting the brown and black people, nor have the brown and black communities ever been protected in Boston, y'all can sit here and continue a lot of this stuff if you want to, but we have to stay here and speak our truth. We have busy schedules as well. I brought my daughter here because she has a dentist appointment, and also she had a doctor's appointment. My schedule is busy too. I'm a single mom with 2 young girls. I sacrifice a lot already, but I also feel that my voice needs to be heard. I've been testifying here since over the summer, and I know y'all see my face all over the place, and I'm proud to have my face all over the place, but just know that this issue is important to me too, because just because of the powers that be, I feel like these folks here, as far as the zoning, they shouldn't have to have a say as far as where I live or how I live or how my children's future should be. I feel like I have a say in that. The same way I was able to travel the world, go to Trinidad, Jamaica, and Europe, and be able to come back to Roxbury and call this place my home, my children should have that same opportunity. Everyone's grandchildren, great-grandchildren should have that same opportunity. But a lot of our children are dying out here, and that's not fair either. Until we're actually protected in Boston, brown, black, Asian, all of these communities, they will continue to sit here and lie to you guys and say, oh, we're friends in here, and we're not. We need to recognize the truth. And I understand that you want to really scrap the BPDA. I think that's a good idea, but they need to recognize the fact of this has been going on for way too long. And if we do scrap it, who are we really going to bring in that is really recognizing community efforts, that is really recognizing if we want to divide up the communities as far as having, you know, folks of the Asian persuasion have their voice, the folks of the Caribbean persuasion have their voice, folks of the from the motherland have their voice. Still, we all have a voice. We all been here. We all are the backbones of this country and the backbones of this state. We can't be pushed out. We can't be pushed away, because sooner or later we're going to come back. And at the end of the day, in the 90s when this city was bad, nobody didn't tell anybody to move. We all could have tackled this whole thing together head on. In the 90s, I was in the South End, Worcester Street, 89 Worcester Street. Me and my mom, we was displaced from South End to St. Matthews, South Carolina. A whole different region, whole different state, whole different way of living. But we was able to survive that. Just because we're pushed out and we're likely to just survive the migration doesn't mean that we necessarily have to.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you.
Is Markeisha here? Okay, sorry, Mike. Markeisha, and then Mike, and then Wheezy.
Hi, my name is Markeisha Moore. I live in Dorchester, grew up here, raised my children here. Would like my children to be able to have the choice if they want to move out of Boston or not, and not be pushed out. I don't want to leave. This is my home. This is the home that I've known. I heard a lot of things that they were saying, and I feel like a lot of it is, I don't want to say fancy talk, but, you know, to talk over people's heads who don't really understand. But we talk about community engagement. I don't even know when any of those zoning meetings were. And I'm actually in an organization, not for sale. So I have never been to a zoning meeting. They say, I've seen a meeting happen, not a zoning meeting, but a development meeting for developers that was crashed. And they mentioned that they have their translators, but these organizations actually had to bring their own translators, because I heard in the video, you know, Lydia saying, we need our translators that we pay for to translate, but why weren't they doing that before our organization showed up? Also, who are they engaging in at these meetings? I've came to a meeting, not zoning meeting, but a meeting that the BPDA has set up with the community and the developers to, you know, pitch their development they want. I've walked in there with different organizations, but we walk in the room, there's 5 people there that don't represent anyone who lives in that community. They live there, but if you have a whole community of Cape Verdeans and Black people and Vietnamese, and you step into a meeting and 4 of the community people there don't look like any of those things, that's not representative of the community. So you're not engaging in the community. You're engaging with the people that you want to engage in. I feel like I heard something earlier, and I don't want to misspeak, but I wrote down that they were saying that there was, you know, they was building a development that was 70% income restricted. And first of all, like, those numbers sound great, but what were the total numbers in that building, in that project? And then what is income restricted? I've looked in the paper for housing, you know, apartments that say affordable at 90% AMI. So because you put affordable in there, that goes with what you're, you know, that you're meeting your requirement. But who Who, where I live, can afford 80% AMI? I've seen affordable at 120% AMI, and I think that's freaking ridiculous. Now, in my community, we're a community of families, big families, you know? Everybody lives together, helps each other out. We talk about the IDP where we want you to include affordable, truly affordable housing, but then they get around that by building 1-bedrooms, studio units, and maybe there's two bedrooms. There's no, I have a 3-bedroom. I can't move into any of those. It's not gonna accommodate me. No. I can't afford to move into it, but if I could, my family's too big for that.
Right.
That's how most of the families are in where they're doing all this building. So they're building, like, to be clear, these people are able to meet their obligations without actually meeting their obligations. So when I say they're doing fancy talk and talking over your head, because nobody really paid attention until it's like now the impact is here. So we are paying attention now. We're not the people in our neighborhood are not stupid. We're just trying to live, we're just trying to survive, right? Yeah. We don't have the time and the leisure to combat what is happening to us because we just trying to live where we are day to day. So you have people who have resource, they have that's their privilege that they can walk out and not listen to us, right? Because they don't have to worry about where they're going to live in 1 year's time because they're secure, right? We sat here and listened to everything they said because we're desperate, right? We're trying to save our homes and we're trying to save our neighborhoods and the people around us. I think that y'all need to look into the zoning amendment. I think a lot of it, I don't want to move into these new developments they're making, right? I don't want to do that. But then once they do that, once they make these new developments, suddenly where I was able to afford is no longer affordable. Right. We have things where landlords in Boston can say, I want my rent comparable to the rent of the neighborhood around me. So once you build these developments and you have a $2,000 1-bedroom and all it takes is one person to rent it, now the market has changed. Yeah. And my income hasn't changed to accommodate what's going on here. And I just want, I don't want what happened to the, Seaport to happen. It seems like that's what's happening, and that was given to us as we're gonna be including everybody, we're gonna have everybody here, and if you go over there, I know black businesses that couldn't even afford to stay over there. So not only could we not live there, but now your business can't even stay open over there because it's not equal. And everybody knows this, and everybody tries to talk around it and make it something it's not. But we're paying attention now, and we're not stupid. So we're gonna be looking at what people are doing and what they're not. And I've said it before, I'm gonna leave Boston kicking and screaming. There's no way you're just gonna do what you're gonna do. You're gonna fight. In the end, I might have to leave, right? Because I don't have the resources. I don't have the money. I don't have any of that stuff to be able to stay. All I have is the fight in me in my community to stay here, right? So I might leave, but you're gonna get a fight. It's not gonna be easy. It's not just going to happen. And I just feel sad because I just wish that they could have stayed here and listen. What our voices are important.
Amen.
You know, we have people who want us to vote for them or want us to keep things around, but it seems like our opinion really doesn't matter. And we're paying attention to that too.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Moore.
So, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mike and then Wheezy.
Hi, I'm Mike Prakash. I'm a Dorchester resident and a member of Dorchester Not For Sale, like Markeisha. And first I want to echo what Markeisha and Amanda were saying about the shortcomings in the BPDA's community engagement process. I won't go into the gory details with the Glover's Corner process, but they never succeeded. The only times that they succeeded in getting representative numbers of Vietnamese folks, Cape Verdeans, was when we brought them.
As in what?
Or when we brought them to the meetings, when we organized and brought residents to the meetings. The BPDA itself did not know how or take the steps to do effective community engagement. Right now, Plan Glover's, the draft BPDA plan, is on the mayor's desk. If it is like past BPDA rezoning plans, it's going to upzone an industrial area, make it easier, quicker, cheaper for developers to build whatever they want there. And what we'll be left with is a series of site-by-site or building-by-building fights over trying to squeeze a little more affordability out of the developer. And that's not what we need. What we need, and what I'm hoping that your amendment will create, is a comprehensive plan that takes responsibility for the impact on existing housing in the area, not just increases, a slightly increased percentage of affordable units in new construction. And that's probably more important than the IDP increase because there's more existing housing than there will be new housing, a lot more affordable existing housing. It's where people actually live. If you don't want displacement, you keep people where they are in the units where they live. And as development moves into Roxbury, Dorchester, East Boston, the new developments are going to be right next to the neighborhoods where we live, and the affordability crisis, the displacement crisis that we're experiencing is going to be magnified, multiplied. It's going to become a flood and not just a crisis. Building clear-outs, rent increases, evictions, the whole bit. So the type of plan that we need would include first a deep survey of the neighborhood, of the families at risk, of rents, and continuing surveys over the period of development so that we can actually track the displacement impacts and the fair housing impacts of the development. It would include massive commitments, for example, to preserve affordability or create affordability, like increase in funding for the Acquisition Opportunities Program, so it's not just 1,000 units citywide over 10 years, it's 1,000 units in the next year or two in Glover's Corner before the development comes in, so that you're stabilizing housing and making sure that people can live there. Probably massive increases in the Office of Housing Stability programs so that people can really be, helped to stay in their homes when they're in crisis, and maybe some new ideas that we've been discussing, like let's do a pilot program on subsidizing rents, cutting property taxes for landlords who keep their properties low. When we raised the issue of the impact on the surrounding area on existing housing in the Glover's Corner process, the lead BPDA planner said, well, this study says that study says this. It's unclear whether new development raises rents and makes the surrounding area more affordable. The experts who live in the area now know that it does, and we have the opportunity to study that right now in Dorchester or any other neighborhood by doing a real study of what's, what are the factors, what are people's income levels, the whole thing. So I'm afraid that the amendment won't be passed in time to cover the Glover's plan. We'll probably just have to fight for that ourselves. But it's crucial that the amendment get passed, but that it include existing housing strongly and not just new housing. Thank you.
Just a point about existing plans already in process. Part of the amendment, or what we want to draft, is that anytime they come back to change their plans, that they now have to include that analysis.
Great.
And we know the plans change.
Yeah.
So I wanted, because the Suffolk Downs in East Boston, that's what I represent, has also already been filed. So that's 20 years of development. And so to think that this could happen in 20 years gets to a free ride. So I wanted to address, I apologize, I didn't want to cut you off, but to let you know.
That's great. And, but the city's much more on the hook.
Yes.
Too.
Yes.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Weezy Waldstein. I'm with an organization called Action for Equity. I live in JP, which got me into the JP Rocks planning process. I work around jobs and income, and so I've been part of the Glover's Not for Sale and Dudley work and around the Dudley plan. So I've seen this process, and I wasn't going to testify, but I wanted to put into the record because of what the folks from BPDA said, just a couple of reality checks. It has, as people have said, it's been a long fight to get more access, more community participation, and that is now, in fact, better. Not perfect, but better. But it's been because of the fight. The plans, when they're done, they say, this is what the community said. That's what we know, and that's what I heard as far as they went. The plans don't then say, how do we achieve what the community wants? And more important, I wanted to just give one vignette that's at the meeting that Markeisha was at, I bet Mike was at it too, which was a dot block meeting after a big fight to get real community meeting with the developer. Now, this is not at the plan level, this is at a site level. And the developer, I didn't know who he was, I don't know him. He was respectful, he was polite, he was friendly. He came to the microphone and he said, I really hear you. And then he played back what he was hearing, and he really heard. And he said, but it's not going to change anything I'm doing.
Oh.
That's the point. That's the moment of impact that we need more power for, more tools. It's not the listening, it's not the knowing what we want, it's who's going to make anybody do anything? What is going to make anybody do anything? He was super polite about it.
Thank you. Yeah, and the goal of that is that it shouldn't be up to the good intentions or sort of generosity of every developer to carry out what the community needs. We should be doing planning on the front end, codifying that into rules that then apply across the board, so no developer can come in and say, I'm going to negotiate to get my way out of it.
And just add one more sentence on that question. It's not a good intention question because it's a market forces question. It's a competitiveness, it's a how to make more money. How does the context of the market change so that developers build this in? And the city says to us, and the BPDA staff says to us, that will constrain the development of new housing. And that's always the trade-off we hear in every part of the city that I'm in. And we have to have that discussion and not just accept that free-fettered development of housing is worth giving up what that means to the communities.
Right. Thank you. Right. I know both of us and many of our colleagues agree that that is the role of government in partnership with the community. Was there anyone else who wanted to testify? Sure. First, is there any other calls for testimony from anyone who hasn't spoken? No? Okay. Ms. Moore, feel free to, Markeisha, feel free to chime in. Yeah.
I just want to say, yeah, like I forgot to mention, I had it in my notes, that we do need way more oversight, because I feel like people are making their, they're making their own decisions. They don't have, like, they're not, nobody's making them do what they're supposed to do. So we do need that in place. And also, it just slipped my mind, something that she just said it, and I wanted to expound on it. So maybe I'm not supposed to. But the oversight, with the developers, the most thing that I hear is what she's saying. Well, we can't tax these we can't, put this constraint on them. We can't do this because then they won't be able to develop. And the way that I look at that is that these people have the money and the means to wait through the appreciation of their developments, when I could be gone, but waiting for it to depreciate back to where I can, I'll be gone out of Boston by then and gone somewhere. Why are we more sympathetic to these people who have it? We need to be more sympathetic to the people who already live in this neighborhood, is already here. We don't have the means to do anything, and it seems like at a group of people's whims, we either get to have to stay in Boston and not be on the outskirts in the nice neighborhoods, or we have to go because now that we want this back. I want to be here through development. I want to enjoy it, and I want my children to be able to enjoy it. But I'm sorry, I just wanted to add those two.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I appreciate everyone's time. Councilor Edwards, a closing statement.
Look, at the end of the day, our testimony, the back and forth with the BPDA demonstrated we can do this. So I appreciate you all coming here. I want to thank the many organizations that work behind the scenes with my office, giving feedback, helping to make sure that the voices that may have not felt heard today were certainly heard in our office in drafting this zoning amendment. And I want to thank you all for being here today. I think we can get this done. I know we can. And so it's just a matter of continuing this conversation. I did not hear a reason why they can't get it done. I agree with them that at the end of the day, whatever we get done, if we do not have applicable, enforceable standards that are clear and upfront, we've done it all for nothing. So that's where I agree with them. But those standards will come from us. Those standards will come from us, and we will put it in there to make sure going forward, building in Boston, we set the standard for if you want to make money here, if you want to build here, along with the environment, along with transportation, along with all the other aspects we asked you to look at. Not only do we ask them to look at it, but we change those standards for them as we go along. Environmental standards 10 years ago are different than what we ask from developers now. I say the same thing. You start the conversation about displacement, you start the same thing about integration, you start the same thing about disability. All of those things will change. So we're not going to let the fact that we're not going to solve racial issues with the zoning amendment get in our way. We're going to definitely have the conversation and analysis going forward, and we're going to change that based on the needs of the community and making sure that when you come to make money in Boston, you make it according to our standards. That's all this amendment's going to do, and it's going to make sure that we have a Boston for us. That's a goal.
Thank you so much. So this will conclude today's hearing on docket number 0647, order regarding a text amendment for Boston zoning code relative to fair housing and integrated communities. This hearing is adjourned.